Picture a Thursday morning in late autumn, the kind of morning that feels completely ordinary. Coffee brewing, cars in the parking lot, briefcases snapped open on conference room tables. The kind of morning where nothing looks like it's about to change. A group of attorneys and real estate investors have gathered in a downtown office to finalize one of the largest commercial property transactions their region had seen in years. Tens of millions of dollars sitting in escrow, documents laid out, signatures pending, champagne probably already on ice somewhere nearby. The man running the room was confident. He had been running rooms like this for years, and as far as everyone in that building understood, the deal was already done. Then the escrow officer's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. She read what was on it. And then she looked up at the man who was still speaking, still gesturing at figures on the page, still doing what confident men do when they believe the world is exactly where they put it, and she said two words that would begin the unraveling of everything he had spent 8 years constructing. She said, "There's an injunction." The room went quiet. Not the polite, momentary quiet of a meeting being interrupted. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes that the floor they are standing on is not as solid as they thought it was. Attorneys began checking their phones. The investors exchanged looks that had no good meaning, and the man at the head of the table, the man who had assured every single person in that room that all authorizations had been obtained, that the owner had agreed, that this was all completely above board, that man went very, very still. Because somewhere across that city, in an office no one at that table had thought to monitor, a woman named Margaret Calloway had already made 3 phone calls. She had filed documents. She had moved first. And she had been waiting to move first for the better part of a decade. They had spent years trying to erase her. And on that Thursday morning, she had simply decided it was time to remind them who owned everything. Before we get into what they did to Margaret Calloway and what she did back, there are 3 questions you need to sit with as this story unfolds. The first, how do you remove someone from something they built when their name is on every document that matters? The second, what does a patient woman do with years of silence, real, deliberate, strategic silence, while someone dismantles the life she constructed from nothing? And the third, which is the one that made this case the subject of conversation in real estate law offices from one coast to the other. Who exactly was Margaret Calloway before any of this began? Because the answer to that question is the one that changes everything. The answer to that question is the reason that when Richard Hale walked into that conference room believing he was about to close the deal of his career, he was walking into something Margaret had prepared for him years in advance. She hadn't reacted. She hadn't confronted. She had constructed. And the difference between those two things is the entire story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to where this began. Because it began, as so many of these stories do, with trust. Margaret Calloway was born in 1954 in a small industrial city in the American Midwest, the kind of place that built things and expected its people to do the same. Her father, Gerald Calloway, was a contractor. Not a wealthy one, not a well-connected one, but a precise one. A man who measured twice and cut once, who read every contract before he signed it, and who believed that the difference between a man who kept what he built and a man who lost it was almost always a piece of paper that hadn't been read carefully enough. Margaret absorbed that lesson early. She absorbed it the way children absorb things from parents they quietly admire, not through lectures or sitting down talks, but through watching, through being in the room, through understanding, by the time she was a teenager, that the world generally rewards whoever has the better documentation. She didn't go to law school. She didn't go into finance. She studied business administration at a state university, graduated without fanfare, and went to work for a regional property development company in the mid-1970s as an administrative coordinator. That title sounds modest, and it was. What it actually meant was that Margaret spent 6 years watching how commercial real estate transactions worked from the inside, how properties were acquired, how LLCs were structured to hold them, how financing was arranged, how titles were transferred, and most importantly, where the vulnerabilities in those systems tended to live. She was not loud in those years. She was not the person in the meeting making the big proclamations. She was the person in the meeting taking the careful notes. By the time she left that company in 1981, she had a clearer picture of the commercial real estate market in her region than almost anyone who hadn't been doing it for 30 years. She also had a modest amount of savings, a very clear sense of what she was looking for, and the patience of someone who understood that the best time to buy a property is when nobody else is paying attention to it yet. Her first acquisition was a small commercial strip in a neighborhood that most of her peers considered unremarkable. She paid below market because she was the only one making an offer. She renovated it conservatively, found tenants, and held it. That was her method. Acquire quietly, improve carefully, hold patiently, never sell unless the number made it irrational not to. By the time she reached her mid-30s, the assessors who periodically valued her growing portfolio had a number that would have surprised most people who had ever met her. Just under $40 million in commercial and residential properties, the majority of them in corridors that were, at the time she bought them, considered secondary markets at best. She drove a practical car. She didn't attend charity galas. She didn't give interviews. She didn't have a profile in the business press. What she had was a filing system that her accountant once described as the most organized set of property records he had ever encountered in a private individual's possession, and a reputation among the small circle of people who knew what she had built as someone you did not want across a negotiating table from you. Not because she was aggressive, because she was prepared. Those are different things. The people who mistook the first for the second, the people who looked at Margaret Calloway's quietness and her modest self-presentation and concluded that she was passive, that she was manageable, that she could be gently moved to the edges of her own operation, those people consistently found that out the hard way. And none of them found it out harder than Richard Hale. Richard Hale came into Margaret's world in the spring of 1993, and on paper, he was exactly what a woman running a $40 million real estate portfolio on her own might reasonably need. He was 41 years old, well-presented, fluent in the language of commercial property, and he had what Margaret, operating largely as a one-woman operation, genuinely lacked: the energy and the appetite for the operational side of things, for the phone calls and the tenant negotiations and the contractor management and the local government relationships that a portfolio of her size required on a daily basis. Margaret had always been the architect. What she needed was someone who could run the building site while she focused on the plans. Richard presented himself as exactly that person, and for the first 2 years he was. He was competent, he was reliable, he delivered results. And he was, by every account of people who knew him in those years, genuinely charming, the kind of person who makes clients feel heard, and makes landlords feel confident, and makes everyone in a room feel like the deal is already done, and all that remains is the paperwork. The problem with Richard Hale was not his competence, it was his ambition, and more specifically, the relationship between his ambition and his patience, which is to say, he had a great deal of the first and very little of the second. Within his first 3 years working for Margaret, he had begun referring to himself in certain contexts, not as her property manager, but as the operational principal of the portfolio. It was a subtle shift, the kind of thing that, if you pointed it out, he could always explain away as an efficiency measure, a way of keeping negotiations moving, a simplification for people who didn't need the full ownership picture. And Margaret, who heard about it eventually, as she heard about most things, did not confront him about it. She noted it, she filed it, and she watched to see what he would do next. What he did next was begin routing certain correspondence through his own office rather than hers. Not all of it, enough to create operational habits, enough to establish himself as the primary point of contact for banks, for tenants, for city officials, for anyone whose relationship with the portfolio could, over time, be redirected toward Richard and away from the woman who actually owned it. He renegotiated 2 tenant contracts in year 4 without bringing them to Margaret first, presenting her instead with agreements that had already been signed. He hired a small team, 2 coordinators and an assistant, all of whom answered to him and had no direct relationship with Margaret. He developed, in short, the architecture of a parallel authority. Not an official one, not one he could point to in any document, but a practical one, a habitual one, the kind that, if left alone long enough, begins to feel like the real structure and makes the real structure look like the ghost. Margaret, watching all of this from what Richard believed was a comfortable distance, said nothing, and Richard, who had met enough quiet people in his life to assume he understood them, interpreted her silence as acceptance. That was the mistake that would eventually cost him everything he had built. Here is what Richard Hale did not understand about Margaret Calloway's silence, and it is the thing that defines this entire story. It was not passive. It was not resigned. It was not the silence of a woman who had looked at what was happening to her operation and decided it was too complicated to fight, or too exhausting to confront, or simply someone else's problem now. It was the silence of a woman who had grown up watching her father read every contract 3 times before he signed it, who had spent 6 years in a corporate real estate office learning exactly where the documentary record of a transaction lived and how hard it was to recover once it had been altered, who had built $40 million in assets not through luck or inheritance, but through the disciplined application of patience to opportunity. That woman did not misunderstand what Richard Hale was doing. She understood it with complete clarity. What she was doing while he was doing it was building a record. Every transaction Richard executed, without her explicit written approval, went into a file. Not a mental file, a physical one, organized by date, cross-referenced by property address, with notes in Margaret's handwriting in the margins about what the proper authorization protocol should have been and where it had not been followed. Every communication she received secondhand, every tenant who mentioned a conversation they'd had with Richard that contradicted instructions Margaret had given, every contractor invoice that reflected work she hadn't approved, every meeting that had apparently taken place in her name without her knowledge, logged, time-stamped, retained. She kept copies of the original versions of documents she suspected had been subsequently altered. She maintained a master property schedule, updated in her own hand annually, that listed every asset, every LLC structure holding it, every authorizing threshold and chain of approval that applied to transactions involving it. And at a certain point, 8 years before that Thursday morning in the conference room, which is to say very early in her recognition of what Richard was doing, she did something that her own attorneys would later describe as one of the most consequential acts of legal self-preservation they had ever seen in a private client. She drove 2 hours to a bank branch in a town where she had no other business and had never had an account. She sat down with a notary. She had brought with her a document she had spent 2 weeks drafting with the help of a retired attorney she had known for 20 years, a man who had no connection to her business, no exposure to Richard Hale, and whose involvement she did not disclose to anyone. That document placed every primary asset in her portfolio into an irrevocable trust, with herself as the sole beneficiary. It was witnessed by 2 individuals, the notary and the retired attorney, who had, in an earlier chapter of his career, served as a county judge. The signed, notarized, witness document went into a sealed envelope. The envelope went into a safety deposit box at that branch. The key went home with Margaret, and she drove back to the city and said nothing to anyone about what she had done. What she had just done, in the language of property law, was make it legally impossible for any transaction involving those assets to be valid without her explicit, verifiable consent, regardless of what any power of attorney, any management agreement, or any forged authorization might claim to the contrary. She had built a wall that Richard Hale would spend years walking toward without knowing it existed, and she had done it in complete silence. In the spring of what the legal filings would refer to as Year 8 of Richard Hale's management of Margaret's portfolio, a regional development consortium approached him about a significant acquisition. These were serious investors, a group of commercial developers who had been assembling capital for several years with the specific intention of acquiring a large block of properties in exactly the corridors where Margaret held most of her portfolio. The offer they put to Richard was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The kind of number that tends to make otherwise cautious men reckless, and that tends to make men who were already reckless feel like destiny has arrived. Richard listened to their proposal. He thought about it for less time than he should have, and then he told them yes, and began working out how to make that yes hold up in a closing room. The core problem Richard faced was a familiar one in real estate fraud cases, and it is worth understanding clearly because it explains every subsequent decision he made. To sell properties that he did not own, he needed to establish legal authority to act on behalf of the person who did own them. In theory, this authority existed in the management agreement Margaret had signed when she brought him on. But that agreement had thresholds, and those thresholds did not cover transactions of the scale Richard was now contemplating. What he needed was either Margaret's direct signature or a power of attorney broad enough to cover it. What he had was neither. What he had instead was 8 years of established operational habit, 8 years of being the face of the portfolio to tenants, banks, city officials, and contractors, and the reasonable expectation that, in the absence of any countervailing voice from Margaret, people would continue to assume that Richard Hale spoke for the operation. Real estate fraud investigators looking at similar cases across the country have noted consistently that this is the point at which schemes of this kind tend to crystallize. The moment a manager or agent crosses from unauthorized action into deliberate misrepresentation and begins treating the gap between what they are permitted to do and what they claim to be permitted to do as a feature rather than a problem. Richard had crossed that line years before he was approached by the consortium. He had been crossing it in increments small enough that no individual step looked dramatic. A renegotiated lease here, a redirected correspondence there, a management authority claimed in a meeting that the actual owner hadn't been invited to attend. Each one of those steps had produced no consequence. And in the logic of a man who had watched his authority expand without resistance for 8 years, the absence of consequence had come to feel like endorsement. It had not. It had felt, to Margaret Calloway, like evidence. Over the 14 months that followed his agreement with the consortium, Richard Hale executed what investigators would later reconstruct as a methodical, layered scheme of property fraud. It was not improvised. It was not chaotic. It had the quality, in the documentary record that eventually emerged, of something that had been thought through carefully by a man who believed, with complete confidence, that he understood the terrain he was operating in and the people he was operating around. He was wrong about that in one very specific and ultimately fatal way. But at the time, the scheme unfolded with a fluency that suggested he had been planning it, in some form, for longer than the 14 months it took to execute. The mechanics of what he did drew on methods that real estate fraud investigators have documented in cases across the United States. He established a series of shell LLCs, entities with no operational history, no real assets, and no employees, created for the sole purpose of receiving property transfers that could be subsequently sold on or refinanced against. He used these entities to move properties out of Margaret's portfolio in transactions that, on the surface, looked like routine restructuring, the kind of thing that happens legitimately in large property portfolios all the time, and that county recorders process without investigation because the paperwork is complete and the fees are paid. In some cases, he sold properties outright to the consortium at prices that were, as the forensic accountant would later document, noticeably below market value, which is a pattern that investigators recognize immediately, because below-market transactions between an agent and a buyer are often a sign that the agent is being compensated separately for facilitating a deal the owner hasn't sanctioned. Tenants received letters on new letterhead informing them that the management of their building had been restructured. Banks received updated account instructions directing certain revenue streams through accounts Richard controlled. Local officials and city contacts who had long-standing relationships with what they understood to be Margaret Calloway's operation received phone calls and meetings from Richard in which he presented himself, plainly and without qualification, as the principal. In the broader picture assembled by investigators, this was the phase of the scheme that prosecutors in comparable cases have described as the normalizing phase. The period in which the fraudulent authority is made habitual, made comfortable, made to look like the genuine article through sheer repetition, and the reluctance of busy institutions to look behind a confident man with organized paperwork. It works more often than it should. It works because the legitimate owner is assumed to be informed and consenting. It works because the only person positioned to correct that assumption is the one being systematically cut out of it. And Margaret Calloway, across those 14 months, was watching every transaction with the careful, unhurried attention of a woman who already had everything she needed and was simply waiting for the moment to use it. The moment she had chosen, not the moment he chose, but the moment she chose, was the closing of the anchor deal. The final transaction, the one that would have liquidated the core of her portfolio and transferred it, effectively and perhaps irreversibly, to a consortium that had every reason to believe the deal was legitimate and had paid significant fees to attorneys who had every reason to believe the same. That was the moment Margaret had identified, months in advance, as the point at which the weight of what Richard had done would be fully visible, fully documented, and fully actionable. not a small, unauthorized lease renewal, not a rerouted correspondence. The whole architecture, assembled and visible in a single closing room, on a single Thursday morning, in late autumn. Richard Hale arrived early that Thursday. He was, by all accounts, in good spirits. The consortium's attorneys were already there. The escrow officer was setting up. Documents were stacked in the center of the conference room table with the neat precision of a transaction that has been carefully prepared and is expected to close without complications. The total value involved, the combination of the anchor properties being transferred plus the financing instruments attached to them, was in the range of figures that tend to make everyone in a closing room move carefully and speak in measured tones. This was the kind of deal that, if it went through, would represent the culmination of 8 years of effort for Richard Hale. It would also represent the most significant single act of real estate fraud in the region's recent history. Richard, in those morning hours, was not thinking of it in those terms. He was thinking of it as the close. What Richard had not arranged for, and this is the detail that his own attorneys would later struggle to explain to a court, was Margaret Calloway's signature, not because he had forgotten it, because he had told everyone in that room, in the weeks and communications leading up to that morning, that her authorization had already been secured. He had represented, in writing, that the owner of record had given her approval for the transaction to proceed. She had not. She had not been asked. She had not been contacted. She had not, in fact, been informed of this meeting's existence through any official channel, because Richard had ensured that official channels ran through him and not around him. What Margaret knew about that Thursday morning, she knew because she had been watching his operational movements for months and had understood what they were building toward. And so, 3 weeks before that morning, she had sat down with her attorney and they had begun preparing. She had called her attorney first. Then she had called the escrow company's compliance department directly. Not Richard's contact there, but the compliance department, the part of the operation whose job it is to flag problems and stop transactions when something is wrong. Then she had instructed her attorney to file an emergency injunction with the county court, blocking the transfer of every property named in the transaction pending a full review of the authorizations involved. Her attorney filed it that Wednesday evening. It was served on the escrow company the following morning, before the closing was scheduled to begin, and while Richard Hale was parking his car and checking his tie in the mirror and preparing to walk into what he believed was the last step of a plan 8 years in the making, Margaret Calloway's injunction was already in the escrow officer's inbox. She had been awake before he was. She had moved before he arrived. She had, in the terminology that her attorneys would later use in the courtroom, anticipated and neutralized the transaction before it could be completed. She had done all of this without raising her voice, and when the escrow officer looked up from her phone and said those 2 words, "There's an injunction," the room Richard Hale had been running for years went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. The immediate effect of the injunction was complete. The closing stopped. The buyer's attorneys asked for a recess. Richard asked for explanations and was given none that satisfied him, because there were none that would. The document Margaret had filed was not vague. It was not a preliminary notice or a holding action or a procedural formality. It was, in the description of one of the reviewing attorneys who encountered it that morning, the most thoroughly documented emergency injunction he had seen outside of major corporate litigation. Every property transfer executed over the preceding 14 months was named in it specifically, by address, by transaction date, by the LLC entity through which it had been routed, by the authorization document Richard had used to execute it, and by the specific discrepancy between that authorization document and the actual authority granted in Margaret's original management agreement. Every forged signature was identified. Every instance of an authorization document that had been created after the fact, backdated in several cases, to appear as if it predated the transaction it was supposed to authorize, was referenced with its document ID and the timestamp that proved it had been created later. The escrow officer, reading through it that morning, later described the experience as reading less like a legal filing and more like a complete ledger of the preceding 8 years of someone's operational misconduct. Richard's buyers understood immediately what they were looking at. Their attorneys understood faster. Within an hour of the injunction being received, the consortium had formally withdrawn from the transaction, pending resolution of the ownership dispute. Their attorneys were already advising them that proceeding in any form while the injunction was active would expose them to liability, and that their good faith argument, while potentially available to them, was not something they wanted to test in a jurisdiction where the documented record of the transaction was this comprehensive. They left. Richard was left in a conference room with a closed deal and a document that said, in precise legal language, that the woman he had spent 8 years removing from her own operation had been watching every single step of it and had the records to prove it. By the end of that week, the legal consequences had begun to propagate outward from that closing room with the speed that tends to follow when a well-prepared plaintiff's legal team begins exercising injunctive authority over a financial scheme. 3 separate financial institutions flagged activity on accounts connected to Richard's management structure and placed holds pending review. The state attorney's office received a referral from Margaret's legal team. A forensic accountant was retained by the court to work backward through the full 14 months of transactions, and then, as the scope of the scheme became clearer, backward through 8 years of operational history. And Margaret Calloway, who had spent a decade being systematically erased from her own empire, had a site visit scheduled for that afternoon and kept the appointment. What the forensic accountant and investigators found, as they worked backward through the records, was a pattern that predated the consortium deal by years and went considerably deeper than a single fraudulent transaction. This is a detail worth dwelling on, because it reveals the full scope of what Richard Hale had been constructing during the period when Margaret's silence had appeared, to him, to be passive acceptance. The forgeries were not improvised at the end. They were systematic. Signatures on authorization documents didn't match Margaret's signature on file at the banks. Power of attorney instruments that had been used to execute certain transactions were found, on detailed comparison, to contain alterations that post-dated Margaret's original signing, clauses added or modified after the document had left her hands, in ways that expanded the authority they conferred beyond what she had agreed to. In comparable cases documented by the Department of Justice and various state attorneys general, investigators have noted that this kind of incremental document alteration, rather than outright forgery of entirely new documents, is actually more common in long-running fraud schemes involving trusted agents, because it produces artifacts that are harder to challenge at a glance and require careful forensic comparison to expose. The shell LLCs Richard had used to route the transfers were not new. The earliest of them had been established 6 years into his management relationship with Margaret, 2 years before the consortium approached him, which meant that the infrastructure for the fraud had been built long before the specific opportunity that triggered it. Investigators also found in those entities a secondary network of property interests that had nothing to do with the consortium deal. Small parcels acquired through option agreements, first right of refusal clauses embedded in documents that appeared to be routine property management contracts, minority interests in commercial developments that had been positioned in Richard's name or in the names of entities he controlled, in transactions that had been authorized using instruments purportedly signed by Margaret. He had been, in the blunt assessment of the lead forensic accountant, building a personal portfolio inside hers, not as a one-time opportunistic transaction, but as a sustained, years-long strategy of parallel accumulation. While Margaret's name was being removed from tenant communications and bank correspondences and meeting rooms, her signature was being used, without her knowledge, and in several cases in a form that bore only a distant resemblance to her actual signature, to build Richard Hale a personal real estate business. He had been using her assets as the foundation for his own, and he had apparently believed, right up until the escrow officer's phone buzzed on a Thursday morning, that he had been doing it invisibly. In the early weeks of the investigation, there was a moment that complicated the picture and nearly gave Richard Hale the window he needed. A second name had appeared with regularity across a number of the transfer documents. A property attorney, based in a city about 60 miles away, who had handled the legal paperwork on several of the transactions Richard had executed over the preceding 2 years. His name was on closing documents. His firm's letterhead appeared on a number of the authorization letters that had been sent to financial institutions. He had, in other words, produced the paper that gave certain transactions their legal cover, and for a period of approximately 3 weeks, investigators gave significant attention to the question of whether this attorney had been a knowing participant in the scheme, whether the origin of the fraud was partly or primarily with him, and whether Richard had been, to some degree, an operational arm rather than the architect. Margaret's position, which she communicated to her legal team clearly and early, was that the attorney was not a co-conspirator. Her reasoning was characteristic of her. She had reviewed the documents. She had looked at what the attorney had been given to work with, the authorization instruments, the management agreement extracts, the ownership records, and she had noted that the versions he had received were the altered ones. The versions that looked, to a reviewing attorney conducting normal due diligence, like legitimate documentation of an ownership structure he had no reason to doubt. He had been used as a validator, given a curated picture that made the transactions look authorized, and relied upon to produce the legal paperwork that made them look final. The full picture of what Richard had actually done was visible only to someone who had access to the original documents, the unaltered versions, the complete transaction history. Margaret had all of those things. The attorney had been shown a carefully selected subset. He was a witness. He was not a partner. But those 3 weeks of investigative focus on the attorney had a consequence that nearly mattered. Richard, aware through his own legal team that the investigation had developed a secondary focus, attempted during that window to restructure certain assets, to move interests held in the shell LLCs into different entities, to create distance between himself and the most directly incriminating of the property transfers, to make the documentary trail harder to follow. He had begun making calls. He had engaged a separate attorney in a different jurisdiction to advise on corporate restructuring. He had moved some funds. The asset freeze, which had been applied to the accounts most directly connected to the transactions Margaret's injunction named, had not yet been fully extended to the secondary entities. And for approximately 10 days, Richard Hale was executing the kind of last-minute financial maneuvering that in some cases succeeds in putting assets beyond immediate legal reach. In this case, it did not. The forensic accountant identified the movement pattern. The freeze was extended. The new entities were identified and included in the recovery action. Richard's window closed, and then came the moment that changed the character of the case entirely. In the discovery phase of the civil proceedings, the phase in which both sides are required to produce documentation relevant to the case, Margaret's attorneys introduced an item that Richard's legal team had not known existed and had not therefore prepared for. It had not been disclosed to them before that point because there was no requirement to disclose it before that point, and because Margaret had held it in reserve with the same patience and calculation with which she had held everything else. It was a sealed envelope retrieved from a safety deposit box at a bank branch 2 hours from the city, a branch Margaret had used for one purpose and one purpose only, in a single visit made 8 years before that Thursday morning in the conference room. Inside the envelope was a document. The document opened with a master property schedule, an annually updated record of every asset in Margaret's portfolio, every LLC structure holding it, every authorizing clause governing transactions involving it, written in her own handwriting, in a format that was immediately and obviously consistent with the internal records her attorneys had already produced. That was not the revelation. The revelation was what came at the back of the document, a single addendum 3 pages long, signed by Margaret Calloway, in a signature that was unambiguous and verifiable against every document she had ever signed in her professional life, and witnessed by 2 individuals, the notary at that bank branch and the retired county judge who had helped her draft it 8 years before. That addendum established, with the legal precision of a document prepared by someone who understood exactly what it needed to accomplish, that every primary asset in Margaret Calloway's portfolio had been placed into an irrevocable trust, with Margaret Calloway as the sole beneficiary, not a revocable trust, which can be modified or dissolved, an irrevocable one, the kind that, in the language of property law that the attorneys in that courtroom understood immediately, transfers assets out of the grantor's direct control and into the permanent protection of the trust structure, insulated from subsequent claims, transfers, or encumbrances that the grantor has not formally authorized through the trust's own governing terms. What that single addendum meant, in practice, was this. Not one of the 11 properties Richard had sold, transferred, pledged, or restructured over 14 months, not 1 square foot of Margaret Calloway's portfolio had ever legally left her ownership. Every transaction Richard had executed was, in the technical and final legal sense, void. He had spent 8 years and 14 months constructing a real estate empire that had never, at any point, belonged to him. He had been building on land that was never his to build on. Richard Hale's legal defense at this point narrowed to a single argument, that he had acted in good faith with the information available to him, and that the trust had never been disclosed to him during the management relationship. It was, in the circumstances, the only argument available. His attorneys made it carefully and professionally. The court examined it seriously, as it was required to, and then the court found it difficult to sustain, for a reason that the civil judgment articulated without ambiguity. A man who acts in good faith does not alter power of attorney documents after they have been signed. A man who acts in good faith does not backdate authorization instruments to make them appear to predate the transactions they authorize. A man who acts in good faith does not establish a network of shell LLCs for the purpose of receiving transfers of properties he does not own, and he does not use those entities to build a personal real estate portfolio funded by assets belonging to someone else. The good faith argument does not survive a forensic accounting report that documents 8 years of systematic misrepresentation, and it does not survive a courtroom in which the plaintiff's legal team has produced documentation so comprehensive that the judge later noted, in the written judgment, that the evidentiary record was among the most thorough he had reviewed in civil property litigation. The civil judgment against Richard Hale ran to just over $19 million. Compensatory damages for the losses suffered as a result of the transactions he had executed without authorization. Disgorgement of the profits he had made from the parallel portfolio he had built inside Margaret's operation. Every option agreement, every first right of refusal clause, every minority interest that had been acquired using her assets and her signature without her knowledge. Attorney's fees and court costs. The criminal referral for fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty was handled in a separate proceeding. There were people in that courtroom who had worked with Margaret Calloway for years. People who had watched, with varying degrees of discomfort and various justifications for their silence, as Richard Hale had steadily made himself the visible center of something she had built from nothing. Those people later described the moment the judgment was delivered in terms that suggest they had been waiting for it for longer than they would easily admit. The room was quiet in a way closing rooms rarely are. Then the gavel came down, and Margaret Calloway picked up her legal pad, put it in her bag, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom without making a statement to the press, without pausing to accept congratulations from her own legal team in any extended way, and without visible emotion beyond what one person present described, carefully, as a small and unhurried smile. She had a site visit to get to. She kept that appointment too. The irrevocable trust structure meant that the legal recovery of Margaret's properties was cleaner than it might otherwise have been. Most of the assets reverted without requiring protracted litigation with the buyers, though a number of the consortium's component transactions did require separate settlement negotiations. Margaret's approach to those negotiations was, by the account of attorneys involved, consistent with her approach to everything else: efficient, fair, and unemotional. The buyers had acted in good faith. They had been deceived by documentation they had no obvious reason to doubt. Margaret settled those cases quickly, and the settlements were described by one of the opposing counsels as more generous than the legal situation required. She was not interested in extending the litigation. She was interested in recovering what was hers and returning to work. Richard's appeal of the civil judgment ran for 2 years and failed at every level. His criminal prosecution proceeded separately and resulted in convictions on multiple counts of fraud and forgery, a sentence that included incarceration, and a restitution order that operated in parallel with the civil judgment. Between the two proceedings, the financial consequences for Richard Hale were, in the plain language that these things reduced to, total. There was also a clause in the irrevocable trust, suggested 8 years earlier by the retired judge who had witnessed the document, that stipulated, in the event of a successful fraud claim involving the trust's assets, that the legal costs of the recovery action would be assessed against the perpetrator's estate. Richard Hale had to sell his house. Margaret Calloway's story is not unique in its mechanics. Real estate fraud involving trusted agents and forged authorizations is, as investigators across the country have consistently documented, more common than most property owners know or want to know. What makes this story different is not the fraud, it is the response, the discipline of it. The patience required to watch something being done to you, systematically and over years, and to document rather than confront, to build rather than react, to trust the structure you prepared over the structure your adversary is constructing. Most people, when they see someone taking what is theirs, reach immediately for a confrontation, or a phone call, or a public accusation. Those responses are understandable. They are human. They are also frequently exactly what a fraud perpetrator has planned for. The premature exposure, the insufficient evidence, the emotional accusation that can be dismissed or managed or turned back against the accuser. Margaret reached for a legal pad. She reached for a filing cabinet. She reached for a safety deposit box 2 hours from the city, and a retired judge who asked no questions she hadn't already answered, and an irrevocable trust document that she then did not speak about to anyone for 8 years. And here is the question I keep returning to, and the one I would put to you now. How many people in your life are being quietly underestimated right now because they haven't raised their voice yet? How many people are in rooms where someone is confidently moving the pieces around, assuming that the silence across the table is passivity, when it might be something considerably more dangerous? And the follow-up, which is the one that tends to produce the longest comment threads when I ask it. If it were you, if someone spent a decade systematically trying to erase you from something you built, something you sacrificed years of your life to construct from scratch, piece by patient piece, would you have had the discipline to do what Margaret did? Or would you have flinched too early, confronted too soon, and handed them exactly what they needed to discredit you? I genuinely want to know what you think, because I think the answer says something important about how most of us are actually built, and about the rare, specific kind of patience that turns a legal pad into a $19 million judgment. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Patient and strategic, or confrontational and immediate, which one do you think actually wins more often in the real world? And which one do you think you would default to if it were your name on those deeds? I read the comments on every video, and I want to hear your genuine answer on this one. If this story held your attention from the beginning to this point, then you already know what kind of content we make on this channel, and hitting that subscribe button means you'll be here when the next one drops. Because the next case we are covering involves a document that was supposedly destroyed in 1987. A man who spent 30 years building an entire professional identity on the assumption that it no longer existed, and the archivist at a state records office who kept a copy for reasons that nobody, including her, has ever fully explained. The moment that copy surfaced, 30 years of carefully constructed history began to come apart in ways that nobody in that story had prepared for. Nobody except, perhaps, the one person everyone had long since stopped watching. You do not want to miss that one. We will see you there.